Hey everybody, Main Brew Guy. We're going to do a lightning round today. It's trying something a little different here on the channel. Let me know what you think, but let's get started. First question. Is secondary fermentation necessary for brewing good beer? Let's even narrow down the question a little bit. Is secondary fermentation necessary for brewing beer? No, it's not. I believe there's good evidence on both sides of the fence. But I think the problem really lies with the question and the way it's framed. So let's reframe the question. Is secondary conditioning required to brew good beer? And I say sometimes yes. There's people out there that say they don't do secondary fermentation at all and that's their thing. That's fine. But technically you are doing secondary fermentation. You're either doing it in the bottle or you're doing it in the keg. And the argument is, well, there's an extra chance for you to expose the beer to bacteria and oxygen. In fact, if you move the beer over when it's still fermenting a little bit, let's say 80 to 90% complete on fermentation, and you transfer into a secondary vessel for conditioning, getting it off the trub and the yeast cake, then there will be enough yeast activity left over to chew up any additional oxygen you may have introduced in the transfer process. So that would negate any issue with moving a beer to a secondary vessel. Now, would you do it with a hazy IPA or a wheat beer? No, you're gonna go ahead and transfer right off the primary for wheat beer into your keg or your bottle. Where I find it to be necessary is when, for instance, let's say you want to clarify or a post fermentation clarifying agent. Really hard to do sitting on all that trub. The longer it sits on there, the more the pH will shift. If you plan on conditioning or clarifying your beer, you may want to move it over to a secondary conditioning vessel and then do your clarifying agent in that vessel. That way, if you're in there for a couple of weeks clarifying, cold crashing, and then subsequently dry hopping, it's best to do it from the secondary vessel. Proponents for not doing it say, well, we just move our beer over into the keg and do a post-fermentation clarifying agent and then cold crash in the keg and then blow off the first 2 pints of whatever the pickup tube will pick up. That is a way. Point is keep the process clean, try not to introduce any oxygen, and conditioning in a secondary vessel. Lagers, pilsners, clarifying secondary. Totally worth it, and it's worth whatever minimal risk that you would introduce. All right, let's move on to the next question. All right, the secondary question is the same thing. It's I've been receiving kind of questions or reading them on multiple platforms. But basically, it's the water profile question. We hear it all the time. Is it really necessary to adjust my water profiles prior to brewing? And if you're starting out, no. There's no need to do that. I don't think any of us has done that right from the get-go. If you're brewing on the stove, the mash process is already done. The beer that you're doing from extract has already been processed the proper way. As long as your water is good tasting, at that point you probably will be able to brew a decent beer. Now, you may not be able to brew the range of beers to style, depending on where you live. Let's say you live in the Midwest and your water profile is really hard and you try to brew a Pilsner or a Blonde Ale, it may not come out right, but you may be able to brew a great IPA. So, for you guys starting out, don't worry about that. That's a natural transition. When you start to do your mash, that's when water profiles become more of a key player in your beer outcome. Not only the correct water profile for the type of beer, but the correct pH. That's the second issue. You want to have the pH in the mash pretty accurate, because the final output from the mash to the beer and then the final fermentation of your beer will produce the correct pH balance for your beer, which is roughly 4.0 to 4.4, I believe. As long as your beer falls in those pH ranges when it's done, and then your beer will probably be really at its brightest and its best. If you're not doing the the pH and the water profile properly in the mash, and you're mashing in at a pH of, let's say, 5.4, your mash efficiency will start to decrease, and your final output of your final product of your beer, the pH will be on the high side, maybe 4.6. The whole perception of the beer will be one-dimensional. It won't be bright. So water profile is absolutely necessary. I knew those two questions were going to take too long. Next question. All right, this question comes from Michael Dibb. He asks, why do you have an expansion tank? They are typically used in a closed system, and yours is open to atmosphere. So he's referring to my expansion tank on my brew stand. The expansion tank is part of the RO water system. It's a standard RO water system that you can purchase that goes under your sink with a spigot. So what he doesn't understand is that my system is not open to atmosphere, nor is the one in your home. You have a spigot you turn on and off, and even if the expansion is empty, you turn the spigot off and it's close to atmosphere. Same as mine. It's a closed system. There's a valve on the top of the expansion tank that I close when the tank is empty, so it remains closed to atmosphere. Now, the second part of the question: why is the expansion tank there? The expansion tank is there as a secondary storage for our water for my brew day, because as there's a coil in my HLT for recirculating, if I use up 50% of the brew water, I would have to add some back to cover the coil to get a good amount of heat exchange on the coil. If I add just tap water, I still have to fly sparge with the water that's in the HLT. If I did that, then the water profile wouldn't be correct going in the sparge. So I use RO water going back in, and that brings me back to 2/3 to 3/4 covered. That brings the water level up to cover the coil so that I get good heat exchange prior to sparging. So that's the reason why I do that. And no other reason. I end up with a lot of RO water at the end of the brew day. All right, next question. Christopher Woods asks, in your video you talk about splashing around the wort when the wort is hot, aka HSA, which is hot side aeration. He states that it's been proven to be a myth. Well, all right. First of all, in that video, I wasn't talking about HSA, I was talking about LODO, and that's the low oxygen dissolved brewing process. There's a German blog site that talks about that, and it's becoming more and more of an experimental thought process here in the US. But to answer your question, HSA, hot side aeration, I think that's a CraigTube misinforming, or folks from CraigTube misinformed. HSA is not a myth. However, I don't subscribe to it. It is measurable. The question is it perceivable? For most of us, we're pretty careful when we're moving around the wort. We're not typically purposefully making it really slosh around or introducing bubbles or anything else to cause hot side aeration. You have to purposefully introduce a lot of air in the system for that perceived level to be able, the actual level to be able to be perceived on our palate. HSA is not a myth. It is true. It's just not perceivable if you have good practice, and most of us have good practice. And in fact, you'd have to have really bad practice to have it perceived. So look up the LODO Brewing, and that would probably answer your question, what I was referring to. I don't really subscribe to that either. I don't think it, I could be wrong. I haven't done enough research on LODO. Anyway, if you guys have any additional questions, or you have questions you would like me to answer, put them down below. If you would like to correct me on anything, I'm sure you won't hesitate. Just try not to sharpshoot on this channel. We're just trying to put out a bunch of information and make sure that it's accurate as possible. We all can learn from that. So anyway, cheers, and remember, no one is smarter than all of us. Share knowledge and brew great beer.